1, 2.
We spend a lot of time talking about rescuing injured from the hot zone and the warm zone in active shooter events. But what about when the injured flee from the immediate area? How do you deal with that? Coming up today, stick around. Welcome to the Active Shooter Incident Management Podcast. My name is Bill Godfrey, your podcast host. I'm joined today by three of our other C3 Pathways NSEER instructors. I got next to me Mark Rhame. Mark, good to have you back in the house.
Thank you for having me.
And we have our newcomer, Maertz. Kami, it's good to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And our veteran, Adam Pendley. Good to see you back, Adam.
Yeah, I feel like I've just seen you recently.
Always the comedian. So today we are going to talk about the pattern of injured that flee the immediate area, flee the scene. So obviously we spent a lot of time talking about how we manage and rescue the injured downrange and the hot zone and the warm zone. But today's topic is going to focus on those that self-evacuate. Now, by the very definition, if they've been injured and they've managed to get up and flee on their own, they are, by definition at that moment, a green patient because they are a walking or a running wounded. But it doesn't mean they're going to stay that way. So I kind of want to hit this at the high level from the idea of our priorities of active threat, rescue, cleared, and then kind of work our way down if everybody's good with that.
Okay.
Adam, why don't you lead us off?
Sure. I mean, so we train a lot. Law enforcement all over the country trains on the idea that we definitely have to get into the crisis site and address the active threat, move towards the sound of stimulus, take down the active threat. But then very quickly we focus on rescuing the injured. And of course, we can potentially do more than one priority at a time, depending on the number of resources you have available. But then the other priority that we talk about a lot is clear. We focus a lot on active threat and rescue, but clearing, the third priority, is still important, not just for an additional threat or some sort of additional suspect maybe, but also to find those that have fled the initial gunshots and might be hiding somewhere, suffering from some injuries. So that clearing becomes an important priority as well, because we also know that over the years we have taught civilians, from the FEMA material, run, hide, fight, or avoid, deny, defend. And so we know that people are going to get out of there when the shooting starts. In those non-custodial scenes, the adults are going to try to get out away from the gunfire. Interesting.
And Kami, when we talk about the people that flee, both the injured and the uninjured, some of them, in some cases, the injured are self-transporting to a hospital or to a medical facility to get care. But in a lot of other cases, they're just trying to get out of the area of immediate danger, and they might flee to a parking lot or they might flee across the street or something along those lines. If they get out of what we would traditionally consider the hot and warm zone, does that mean that we don't have to worry about threats?
No, absolutely not. So what we have to consider in that is the threat has fled among the group that is running from the location. It's another reason it's important for our contact teams to give a good LCAN when they show up on scene, to be able to give that information so that we can set resources for those people who are leaving the area.
Now, you mentioned LCAN.
For your location, conditions, action, and needs.
Okay, so like a size-up report.
Yep, as soon as the first officer gets on scene to tell us what they're seeing, what they're hearing.
Okay. Now, Mark, from a medical perspective, so you've got presumably some injured that are downrange in the hot and the warm zone, and we're either on our way pushing resources to rescue them or in the process of doing that rescue. That may even have been completed or close to being completed. How do you then manage the injured that have fled, that fled at the time with green injuries but may not be so green anymore?
So what we practice and what we really prefer our responder to do is set up that hot warm zone. We contain that area. Law enforcement is going to set up perimeters in that, inner perimeter, outer perimeter, whatever they establish. And then we have a tactical triage and transport team that are dealing with everything inside that hot zone and that warm zone. And their concentration is that. So when you're a medical branch at the command post, which is in a cold environment, cold zone, they stand up that command post, they should be thinking right off the bat, am I accounting for everybody? Is everybody inside of that hot and warm zone? If not, do I need to start thinking about something outside of that area or outside the traditional area that law enforcement is looking for that threat and all those people have been rescued? And maybe at that point in time, depending on what environment it is, they may want to establish some kind of a secondary location for a casualty collection point, a treatment location, just in case they're starting to come across people who are self-evacuated, or you came across them when you're starting to clear other structures that are in that environment.
Yeah, and it seems to me like the easiest thing to do in that situation, because we're already in that mode, is just to designate a second casualty collection point. That's
Well, I
in
think
that
the
area
problem
where
with that
they've
is, Bill,
collected.
is that are you going to be correct though? I mean, wherever you select that, there's nothing wrong with saying, you know what, this may be the most ideal location, but it may not be the correct location. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, you talking about like in the parking lot outside, or
Yeah.
what do you mean?
Or, well, if you're saying that, this is this is my hot and warm zone right here. This is what I've established because this is where the shooting occurred, where most of the victims are. But if you're saying, well, we just need to set up another one at this location, well, it may not be where you need to set it up. If that makes any sense. I mean, frankly, that second CCP should be a place that, oh, wait a second, we're starting to see more people ran to this parking garage, or they ran to that movie theater. Maybe that's our second CCP.
Sure. So Mark makes a great point. We've seen in a lot of incidents where a coffee shop or something that happens to be next door ends up being an ad hoc location where some injured have fled to. They're starting to do some self-care amongst themselves. And so to Mark's point is, rather than from the command post picking a place on a map, you might have to do what we were just talking about. You might have to listen to those initial reports about where people have fled to, and then that brings it full circle to what we're saying is that place that the injured kind of already selected as the place they were going to flee to, that becomes your casualty collection point, rather than having to you're outdoor or you're away from the immediate crisis site casualty collection point. And then, of course, like we've talked about, you have to name them, right? So if you have a casualty collection point in the crisis site, it needs to be named whatever location it is, and maybe the one that's next door or nearby becomes
The coffee shop,
the
CCP,
coffee,
or
exactly
something like
right.
that.
And as long as you're clear about that, I think that all works.
So, assuming that all unfolds in the first 10, 15 minutes of this, as you're starting to get your arms around the thing, from the law enforcement perspective, does that mean because you haven't cleared that area, we don't know that there's any, so you got to adjust your perimeters, and that's technically going to, if it wasn't in our warm zone, it is now, and that
Absolutely.
we're going to wrap that, or what does that look like?
It's definitely going to, determine the size of your perimeter. If you know that people are fleeing from that area, your perimeter is going to be larger. And one of the things that we always teach, right, is that you want to set that perimeter larger, that warm zone larger. You can adjust it down smaller, but it's harder to make it bigger. So when you're getting on scene and you're noticing that those perimeters are going to be extended, that's a good thing to keep in mind of where people fleeing to, where can we, get them concentrated in.
Well, and I think the other thing that's really important here, and it's why it's important to discuss the kind of the difference between the injured that you have, is that we've also seen in cases where some of those initial RTFs or those initial medical and law enforcement teams that are going into the crisis site, they were sent to a casualty collection point inside where your most critical patients are. Those are the ones that have not been able to evacuate. Those are the ones that law enforcement can't even move because they're so seriously injured. And so it's critically important that those RTFs complete that mission and that they don't get held up by trying to treat patients that run up to them, because and I'm sure Mark can speak to it in greater detail, but those injured that run up to you and say, I need help, you don't want to leave them, but you need somewhere for them to direct them to.
I think from the medical management perspective, the responsibility falls to that RTF team. They've got a task and a purpose, and that's where they're supposed to go. But if something happens, if they get a crowd, they get hung up, then their obligation is to call back to triage and say, we are not able to complete that mission. We've been pulled to this. We need another team assigned to our original mission, and we suggest you route them this way so that they don't get into, not the same way they went, but route them a slightly different way so that they don't get into kind of the same issues. Because I think there's a balance there. Depending on the nature of the injuries, you may be able to say, yeah, run right over there and we'll be with you in just a minute, or the horror of the thing, somebody's running carrying somebody in their arms, and you take one look and go, okay, this is a critical patient, and it gets you hung up. And I think, Mark, would you agree? I think we've got to leave that to that RTF team leader to either stay on his original mission and call back and have triage, assign another team, or one or the other.
I would agree with point to a certain extent. First off, is that I would never have expect any of my team, my medical team, to abandon a patient. Frankly, they need to either take care of that patient or get them to a place where they're going to be taken care of. Because you do not want to say, if you're injured in any certain degree, say, well, just head that direction. There's help over there somewhere. No, that's probably the wrong move. Probably the best thing to do is I think Adam just said a minute ago, is convey that information as quick as possible. You may get overwhelmed at your staging location, which should be, again, in a cold location. Your staging location may get overwhelmed with people who are uninjured and injured, and all of a sudden, instead of deploying people from that location, you're starting to treat right there. Well, of course, the people in the staging are thinking, well, this is it. This is all the people that are injured. Well, in fact, it is not. It's probably the place where the shooter was that are where the majority of the injuries are, especially the serious ones. So command's got to quickly realize, if we get overwhelmed here, we may have to establish another secondary casualty collection point at staging, and for this example, but you're still going to have to deploy those rescue task force to the original site. So you got to get, make sure that you're thinking about that in the back of your head, especially with adults who are going to run. The little guys, probably not. But when you talk about adults, they're probably going to run, they're going to hide, they're going to be in some other location. So from a command perspective, you need to be thinking about that in the back of your head. Do I need to stand up teams right now? We're already taking care of the threat. We've got a shooter there. We're taking down the threat. We're standing up rescue task force to move into that hot, warm zone so we can start working on those patients there. But do I need to start standing up teams, rescue task force, contact teams, for the possibility that there's another site we're going to have to stand up? Be prepared for it. Lean forward. Do not wait for them to declare another site.
Well, and what Mark is saying, actually, I think that falls right back on law enforcement, that if we are securing a casualty collection point, we've called for the RTF. We can't just call for it one time. Not that we need to scream for it over and over again, but if we're hearing other radio traffic that maybe the RTFs are getting hung up with some patients that are coming out and meeting them halfway, we need to be clear and concise with confirmation on our radio talk or communication that we still have injured in this CCP and we need an RTF here. So I think patients or injured folks fleeing to in flagging down RTFs or medical personnel create some challenges, but they can be overcome if you follow the process. And that's why it's so important for tactical triage and transport to be standing shoulder by shoulder and working through those problems.
I think especially with that, for tactical to be aware that has now created that second CCP. And so are the resources going to stay there? And if they're going to stay there, that's fine, but they're making that decision. You are staying here, and we are sending the additional resources to the original CCP, CCP1, CCP2, whatever it was, that those additional resources are getting there, and that tactical doesn't just have a mindset that they're out there, that they know exactly where their resources are.
It's an interesting challenge. Mark mentioned the idea of patient abandonment, which, of course, on a normal day-to-day thing, when you're dealing with one patient at a time, no medic or EMT would ever do. In the case of a mass casualty incident, we are, by very definition, rationing our health care. And the whole idea of triage is that before you get engaged in treating anybody, you need to first figure out who is the worst, who is in the most need of treatment that's going to benefit the most, and judge that. And the challenge in an active shooter event, as we're talking about here, is that your injured can be spread out. And so one of the things that has, and we've talked about this before on other podcasts, one of the things that has become a challenge for the current generation of EMTs and paramedics that are in the field is they've gotten very used to saying, this is my patient, I'm going to have another rig or another team take care of that patient over there, and they get tunnel visioned in. And it would be very easy to have a crowd of 5 or 6 injured come towards you, and you say, okay, I've got 2 or 3 medical people with me, and I'm going to start working on these. And then the other team that's supposed to be reassigned to do your original task, that's going to where the critical patients are, comes the same path and then gets hung up in dealing with those couple of other patients. And you've got to remember, you absolutely have to remember, and this is the difficulty of a mass casualty incident, is your first step is to identify the injured and triage them. And we can't dump all our resources on the ones that just present, right to us. And I think that's kind of, Mark, I think the balancing point, because there's right and wrong starts to become a little more gray in the mass casualty incidents, and those can be very difficult decisions to make. especially if people haven't talked about it or thought about it before.
And we get into this struggle when we teach the active shooter incident management class when we talk about rescue task force. And I really try to convey, and I hear other instructors do the same thing, about the first rescue task force that gets on the scene has to take control. I don't mean control from a security-wise, because law enforcement will always own that environment. The contact teams own the security of that site, and they own the incident command. But that first RTF, especially when they get into the known casualty collection point, I always say, ask 2 questions. Am I needed, and do I need help? And you need to ask that before you walk in the door. I'm kidding there. Literally has to be done right now, because if you wait, you're behind the curve. So if you walk in the room, am I needed? Hell yeah, I'm needed. Look at all these patients here. Second thing, do I need help? How many do I need? Do a quick count here. Give me 3 more RTFs based upon the number count. And then maintain the control EMS-wise of that room, because otherwise you're playing Groundhog Day. The next RTF comes in there and they start doing the same thing that you started, and the next RTF does it. No, you're that first RTF. You walk in there and go, I need more help. When those teams get there, RTF 2, you got those 2 patients right there. RTF 3, you've got those 2 patients right there. And just start assigning them out while you're starting to treat these people, because you don't want to start repeating yourself over and over again, because we know what are the 2 things that are going to kill those people. It's the threat and what else?
The clock.
The clock.
Yeah.
And you're going to eat up the clock if you do the same thing over and over again. So you got to take control of that room from a medical perspective, your first RTF that gets there.
And the other thing that I'll add on to that, because, Mark, I think is right on the money talking about that first RTF through the door. The thing to remember is it's the first RTF through the door at that CCP location.
Yes.
So you might be the first RTF through the door where the shooting occurred in the, in the warm zone downrange, but then 10 minutes later, you might be the first RTF to get to the coffee shop and go, holy crap, there's 5 or 6 people that have been shot in here.
Right. Yeah.
And it's the same thing that you've got to employ there is
Exactly.
to take charge of it and kind of manage it. Now, I do want to shift gears a little bit and talk about when is the right time to set up a treatment area. So, we teach routinely. Let me back up even a step further. Most active shooter events are not mass casualty incidents. They're not. The median number shot is 3, and of those 3 shot, 1 is killed. That's not a mass casualty incident for anybody to have 2 viable patients that you need to treat. That said, they can be mass casualty incidents, and what we're really talking about here, where you've got people that have fled where the violence occurred, and then you've got injured that have fled, you've got injured that are still downrange. We are tending to talk more, presumably, about a mass casualty incident. And so normally in these things, the numbers are not high enough to warrant a separate treatment area. It just becomes a delay. You want to triage them, do whatever emergent stabilizing treatment you need to do right there at point of care, and then get them on an ambulance off the scene. So when you suddenly have enough patients that are overwhelming the number of ambulances you've got, and I would narrow it down to that one thing.
One thing.
It's not even so much about the people, it's about the transport assets. When you now have a number of patients and you do not have an adequate number of transport vehicles, whether it's ambulance, whether it's the back of a pickup truck, improvising, whatever the case may be, that's when I think you need to put in place a treatment area and engage in that extra step to try to continue to provide treatment while we're waiting for transport assets to work. So Mark, I'd like you to comment on that, and then I want the 2 of you to talk about what security implications that could happen for you, that we've set up a treatment area that we may be moving them from CCPs to this treatment area. Mark?
Yeah, and I agree with you that treatment area is a clock killer. I mean, literally, if that's your first thought, I got to stand up a treatment location. Well, in fact, you don't need it because you've got enough transport units to get the critical patients off the scene quickly. But again, if those treatments or those injuries, especially minor injuries, overwhelm your transport units, then a treatment area makes sense. But what we haven't been talking about, and we cannot dismiss, is we're talking about trauma. What about medical costs? What about the person who has chest pains, has a stress issue, they're normally a diabetic, and a seizure, whatever it happens to be? we need to be prepared for that also, because those medical issues are going to crop up. And especially if this thing marches on where we're not transporting these people immediately, we're holding them because they're not our critical patients. These other people, we're trying to get them to a trauma center. We're trying to get them under a surgeon's knife because that's how they're going to survive. These other people, we tend to hold off to the side, but we can't put them out of our minds. So then that treatment center, hopefully it's a very secured, hopefully indoor place, but if not, we need to create that environment and then start a treatment environment there and start triaging those people out and saying, okay, priority here, this is my least priority, these when I get a transport unit, as soon as I can, I'm going to get them off the scene. These people here are going to go last. But we also may have to send those to the farthest location away, and it may be another community or an hour away because they're not my priority right now. My priority is these people who've been shot, especially the ones who've been shot between their chin and their navel. There's not much I can do for them on the scene. I got to get them to a trauma center.
Absolutely.
Agreed.
So, I mean, the first security issue that comes to mind is one of the things we talk about a lot, is that there are more jobs that need to be done. So we stress over and over again that not every law enforcement officer on the scene can go inside. We need some to stay with the RTFs. Law enforcement needs to be aware of the treatment group area concept that, hey, when there's a number of patients, we may have to secure that as well. It's a job that's different even from perimeter. Like, you have to have a security element there with the treatment group as well. And it's just, like we've talked about many times, the clock is running at all of these locations, right? So we have to work so well together to make sure that we're communicating and doing what we need to do.
Mm-hmm. And I think even that, and considering if it's going to be an inside or outside, depending on the resources that are available for security purposes, is that an inside facility is going to be a lot easier to get containment on than an outside, and those are going to have to be special circumstances that you're going to have to consider from command and tactical and triage and staging to get the right resources in.
But let me emphasize something, Bill, on this, and I know we briefly talked about it a second ago, but what I would warn the people who are in the command post, the incident commander, the law enforcement branch, and the medical branch when they're stood up, is that sometimes they feel like they need to do something. I've got a tactical officer, I've got a triage officer, I've got a transport officer who are in that hot warm zone, and they're doing stuff. They're doing God's work. They're out there taking down the threat and doing the medical work. They feel like, well, I've got to do something. I would caution those people, say, well, as a medical branch, well, I'm just going to stand up a treatment group because I want to do something. No, you're wasting your time and resources. If your teams are doing the work that you've put them in the position to do, you should stand back there and go, this is the greatest, this scene is working really well. I got great people in this job or in these positions, and I'm just going to support their mission. You don't have to do it unless it's necessary. As we talk about a treatment group or a secondary CCP. If you don't need it, don't do it. You're wasting time is what you're doing.
And Kami, I was going to piggyback off something you said a second ago. You mentioned relocating it to the inside or moving them to the inside because it's a lot easier to secure the inside to the outside. And it made me think, on the fire and EMS side, on the medical side of this, we need to be prepared for those conversations with law enforcement. If the law enforcement officers, whether they're part of our RTF or whether they're just additional law enforcement officers, a contact team, part of perimeter, says, I need you to move these people inside, we need to be prepared to hear that and not give them a bunch of lip. And I'm reminded of the one incident that occurred, West Coast, the fire department who did EMS did not coordinate at all with law enforcement and picked their triage location and their treatment location, and they picked the middle of an intersection, which was great for them. And it was completely exposed and ironically directly exposed to the attack building where the attacker had fled and location unknown. And law enforcement was desperately trying to then react. They had not only the building of concern, but now they've got the fire department who just compounded their problem and failed to coordinate that with it. And we want to make sure that we're not those guys and gals. If we're prepared for that conversation, and if law enforcement says, hey, from a security perspective, we need to move it. But I think that needs to be part of the keywords as well. I mean, if you said, hey, move those people inside, I may not be very receptive to that. But if you
Absolutely.
said from a security perspective,
Absolutely.
we got to get these people inside. We can't cover you out here. That's going to get my attention.
Well, it's what we preach through this whole class. The active shooter incident management concept is it's an integrated response. And if you don't integrate it, if you don't stand tactical triage and transport next to each other and their game plan is one and the same, you're going to fail. If the command post is siloed, if you have a command post for law enforcement, one for fire EMS,
Oh, God.
if you silo those, you're going to fail. Every after action report you look at where there was failures, most of them will come back and say, well, we siloed our command posts. We had a command post for law enforcement and one for fire EMS, and they didn't coordinate their efforts. If you integrate your response, if you put them together and they come up with a singular concept of what they want to do, and their action plan is one and the same, you shouldn't have those issues. Right. So long as all the information is flowing downhill and getting to the right people.
And I would go one step further and say it's not just integrated response. You have to do integrated training and preparation as well.
Yes.
Exactly.
These conversations all have to happen before the crisis day to think through some of these scenarios where it gets a little unusual and some creative problem solving. I mean, another West Coast incident with a more positive result, many patients, all over the place. And they used some of their recall of off-duty firefighters and paramedics to go to the urgent care centers and to some other places that were being overwhelmed by patients. So that was a smart use of resources to try to supplement what was going on. And so I think, when you, again, not very... Fortunately, they're not all mass casualty incidents, but it is worth giving some effort to thinking about the ones that have patients that flee and hide in other buildings, hide in portalets, that hide under the stage, that hide in a number of places where you have to sort all that out.
And I think the other thing that we've got to remember, Mark, you alluded to this, you come up with a singular plan, and typically on the command side, things do flow downhill. I think we also have to remember on the command side, especially at the command post, you've got to listen to your troops that are working for you. If your RTF calls triage and says, I need to move this or I need to make this change, or the ambulance exchange point we've selected is not working well, we don't necessarily at the command level need to understand why.
Yes.
We just need to listen to the troops and, as you said, support them and react them. And I think it's kind of like, and I've heard this in a couple of after actions and examples where they've ended up with a fire department command post and a separate law enforcement command post. And the story almost always sets off the same. Law enforcement isn't quite ready to get their command post stood up. So fire department just sets one, takes command on their own. Law enforcement gets to that point, but then we're unwilling to break ours down and move it. And I think that's one of the places that we get tripped up. And I could see that happening here. You've got a second or even a third casualty collection point that stood up and it's outside the coffee shop and you're trying to work on that. And now law enforcement saying, I need you to move them inside the coffee shop and we cannot load the ambulances in the front. We need to load the ambulances in the back of the building. And all of a sudden this plan that you've been crafting goes right out the window. And there's a tendency to be resistant to that. And I understand it, but you can't. You've got to listen to the people that are downrange.
Yeah. The boots on the ground have the best vision of what's going on. And we run into this in classes on a regular basis where for some reason the command post thinks because they can look in a map and go, well, that's a good place for it. When in fact, are they the ones with the greatest vision of what's going on? I would say no. You got to trust your people. And that means from the command post perspective, contact one, what is your perspective? If you ask the question, what is your best location for a casualty collection point? Let them be the ones to make the decision because they're the ones that got to move the patients, not you from the command post. They're the ones that got to treat the patients and move them to an ambulance exchange point. Trust them to make the right decisions and support their mission.
Sure.
Right. It's the phrase I use is this is one of those circumstances where it's okay to delegate up and have them, accomplish some tasks that need to get done because you have the best eyes on the scene. We're so used to managing, whether it's sergeants or lieutenants on the police side, being able to kind of see the whole picture and then make command decisions from there, or the battalion chief who's running the fire ground, they can see almost everything. That's not often going to be the case in these types of scenarios.
Very true. All right, we'll wrap it up, lightning round. Mark, final thoughts or comments, and I'll go around the table.
One thing that I would recommend if you've got especially a large scene going on where, especially like the outdoor ones, where you have this belief that maybe a lot of people ran off and you're in the command post, so if you're in the medical branch or maybe you're a law enforcement branch, is probably stand up some strike teams when you have capability of doing so. Once your resources have been already met for the either the known threats, that known environment, stand up a couple RTFs and maybe a couple contact teams, say stay in staging. As we start clearing, as we're getting more intel, we may deploy you, but lean forward, build those teams out before even anyone asks for it. Have them ready to go once you get the resources necessary to do that.
All right. Kami?
I think one of the things we mentioned is trusting in your training so you can trust in your people. So, make these relationships beforehand, trust in your training, do good training, and then you can trust your people to do the job they need to do.
And I would say incorporate this into exercises. Oftentimes we see active shooter exercises where the teams, they get to go from one fixed location, they're directed to another fixed location.
Very clean environment.
Very clean environment. So, incorporate the idea that maybe from the room that you're sent to, you learn that there are 5 people missing and that you then have to account for them. And, nothing wild, but just the idea that you have to make sure you account for all the people that may have fled.
And Mark, I'm going to tag on to yours. I think the note about standing up a quick reaction force, if you will, in staging is a really, really good one. If you do have one of these that is a mass casualty, and I'm going to say more than 10 patients, if you do have one of these that's a mass casualty, the chances that you're going to get the echo calls or the ghost calls or the those secondary calls because somebody has fled to another location. And now we think, and I Vegas is the best example of that because they had follow-on calls at all the hotels, and they didn't have shooting at those calls, but what they did have was injured at all of those locations. And so you still have to push out the RTFs. You still have to get those locations secured, just like we're talking about now. So I love the idea when you've got enough resources in staging, and for most of the country, not everywhere, but most of the country, people are going to show up. If you get them in staging and you've got some extras, get them organized into a QRF and be ready to deploy them. And let command know. If command didn't think of it, that's okay. Let them know you've got a team ready to go. Yep. Well, thank you everybody for coming in. I think this is a great topic. For those of you that are listening, if you have not subscribed to the podcast or on our YouTube channel, please do so. And please share this with the people that you work with. This training doesn't help if the message doesn't get out to everyone. I want to thank our producer, Carla Torres. I often invert my words. Sorry about that, Carla. Thank our producer, Carla Torres, for everything she does to make these look seamless and even clean up when I reverse my words. Until next time, stay safe.